So I have been really excited about this LBW service for a few months now. It's not just because the Lutheran Book of Worship was released around the time I was born, and so it's what I grew up with, and it's really imprinted on my heart. It's also because of this particular service that we chose to replicate. So in the back of your bulletin, we have a reproduction of our actual bulletin from February 4th, 1990. And that's the service we're doing today. Music's the same, everything's the same, liturgy's the same, which we did last week too with the 1968 service. And if you're wondering how we got these old bulletins, that is thanks to the foresight of our choir director in the 60s, Don Smith, who began filing away a bulletin each week in the year 1965. And tucked away in a closet downstairs are 37 folders until electronic storage took over in 2002. And inside, in chronological order, are all the bulletins from that year. I had so much fun going through these folders in preparation for this series, this historical series. So if you think about, okay, well, how did we choose which service to reproduce? Well, we looked at services in late January, early February for each year, because we wanted to find a service from the same liturgical season. And we tried to choose services that gave the sense of being representative. For a long time, Muhlenberg's tradition was that the last Sunday in January, the youth would lead the service. Some of you probably remember that. And those services were very different from what was normally happening here. And so we decided not to recreate those. We wanted something that would be more typical. Then we looked at the music for each week, and Lean and Judith did a great job of digging around to see if they could find the music, the exact music for the preludes and the postludes and the choir anthems, so we could really do it right. Ideally, we wanted a communion service, since we share communion every week. But that was tricky, particularly in the 60s when we didn't have communion here very often. But even in the 80s, we were having communion every other week. We got to weekly communion in the 90s. But what led me to want to do this particular service from February 4th, 1990, was none of those things. It was, quite simply, Pastor John Derrick's sermon title for the day. If you still have it open, check it out. The title he gave the sermon that day was Salty Folks Who Light Up. I don't know why that tickled me so much the first time I saw it, but it really did. I took a photo of it and sent it to pretty much all the staff. Said, we have to do this one, it's so funny. And I don't think they found it like quite as haha funny as I did, but they humored me and said, okay, we can do that one. Honestly, even now, the title still makes me giggle a little bit. It brings me joy. Salty Folks Who Light Up. Thank you, Pastor Derrick. Now, Pastor Derrick was preaching from a different text that day. You see that in the bulletin. The Revised Common Lectionary hadn't even been released yet, let alone the narrative lectionary. So his assigned text from the Common Lectionary was from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. You are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. So, salty folks who light up. I also love that we're going to hear the Godspell version of this in a little bit, thanks to the leadership team of the 1990s choice of anthem for that day. But we don't get salt and light in our reading for today. We get this long passage from the Gospel of Mark that at first glance seems to be 3 separate stories. But on closer inspection, we see that Mark is using a literary device that he, as a gospel writer, actually uses a lot. It's called intercalation. That's your cocktail party fact for the week. Intercalation. It's a fancy term for a story sandwich. We saw it last week with the story of the woman who was bleeding, interrupting the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter. Right? So Mark starts one story, That's like the bread on either side, and then he puts the meat or the peanut butter or whatever in the middle to make this story sandwich. And he does this quite deliberately in order to get us to read these stories together and see how they work off each other and play together. So we begin today with Jesus returning to his hometown. Now, scholars think that Nazareth was probably a town of about 300 people at the time, so pretty small. Everybody knew each other. It reminds me of my high school, which was also very small. We had 45 in my graduating class, and the school had t-shirts they would sell that said, St. Joseph High School, where everybody knows your name. And we would always add, and your business. There certainly are benefits to being part of a small community where everybody knows each other really well, but the reality is that people do see you at your best, but they also see you at your worst, and they often remember you at your worst. And in this case, it seems that indeed familiarity did breed contempt. The people of Nazareth couldn't believe that this Jesus guy was anything really special. They'd seen him grow up. They'd changed his diapers, right? And so it makes sense that they might look at him and think, that's just Jesus from the block. But the fascinating part to me is this line that he could do no deed of power there. That's what Mark says. Jesus could do no deed of power there. Their rejection of his authority actually limited what he was able to do. Now, it does say, except he did lay his hands on a few people and cured them. Because God is going to do what God is going to do, with or without our faith in that. But the human Jesus had these real limitations. He couldn't always do what he wanted to do, what he was called by God to do. Now, for those of us who are mortal and finite ourselves, which last I checked was all of us, I think this can actually be comforting. We've all experienced times where we can't do what we feel like God is calling us to do, for very human reasons. Like, people won't listen to us and reject what we're trying to do. Or we're unable to do things because our bodies are indeed finite. They're not infinite. They have limits. And illness or injury or anything that makes us differently abled can be so frustrating. These past few years, as I've dealt with my own health challenges, I can't tell you the number of times I would be lying in bed thinking, God, why am I dealing with this? When I just want to do what you've called me to do? Why can't I just get up and go do the ministry I thought you wanted me to be doing? We have limits. And sometimes we have limits because we simply do things the wrong way, because we don't know how to do it right. Or we run out of time, or we run out of energy, or we don't have the financial resources we would need to do a thing, because we're human. And as Kate Bowler so memorably says, there's no cure for being human. None of us can do it all. All of us are going to fail sometimes. Sometimes we'll fail a lot. We have more limitations than we want, even when we're doing our absolute best to do God's work. And Jesus did too. God knows what it's like. That's a comfort to me. And when Jesus runs up against these walls, these limits that he has, it's really interesting what he does. He doesn't smite the village in anger or anything like that, but he does take a step back. He doesn't do any healings or exorcisms or miracles for the rest of this chapter in Mark. No, he doesn't give up and walk away either. It says he does go among the villages teaching. But instead of doing the healing work himself, he commissions the disciples to go out and do it. Because even Jesus himself could not do it all. It required a community. I think sometimes when we hit our walls, our limits, instead of simply being frustrated at our humanity, our finiteness, we're invited to look around and see who else is doing God's work. Because maybe in that moment, we aren't called to do the thing, whatever the thing is. Maybe God is busy empowering someone else to do it. Maybe we can share our wisdom and experience as Jesus did as he went around teaching, but we have to hand the doing to someone else. And vice versa, right? When someone else reaches their limit, we need to be aware that it's our turn to pick it up and pay attention to the ways that God has empowered us and sent us with authority. We are made to be in community. None of us can do it all. We walk together. When Jesus sends his disciples out, it's not as these like Lone Ranger superheroes. He sends them with a buddy. He says, go out 2 by 2. We are meant to do God's work together. And Jesus even tells them not to take everything they're going to need. We really like being independent, self-sufficient people. I'll speak for myself. I really like being an independent, self-sufficient person, right? I want to pack my bag with anything I might need for the trip, just in case, because I don't want to have to bother anybody else, right? That's not what Jesus tells them to do. Jesus instructs them to be really vulnerable, to not take an extra coat, to not pack their bag full of money, to rely on the support of others. It can be so hard to ask for help sometimes, right? But Jesus literally sets up the work of the kingdom to require us to ask for help and to respond with hospitality when someone needs us. We have more limits than we want, but we have more power than we realize sometimes. And that's where the peanut butter of this story really brings this into sharp focus. The story in the middle, the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. We see King Herod, who wasn't actually the king, he was the tetrarch who only ruled over 1/4 of the area. He really wanted to be a full king like his dad, and historians at the time recorded his feeble attempts to do that, which ended up getting him banished to Gaul. He never did get to be king. But we see here a guy who still has a remarkable amount of power. He is the tetrarch. He is the most powerful man in the room. When at his drunken birthday party, they send in his young stepdaughter to dance. And yeah, that's as icky as it sounds. And he says, oh, that's great, whatever you want. And she has to go ask her mom, who totally manipulates her, to come back in and say, John the Baptist's head. Because she didn't like that John the Baptist had criticized the fact that Herod had married his brother's sister while brother was still alive. She didn't like it. So she manipulates it so that Herod appears to have to follow through on this promise. But does he really? Because he is the strongest guy in the room. He has the most power. And he could have said, oh, sweetie, that's not a good idea. How about I get you a pony instead, right? Like, he could have done that. But it says that because of the others who were there, he felt like he had to do it. He felt like he would rather save face than save John's head. He didn't want to appear weak. He had more power than he knew. But he was scared of losing that power, scared of the people who were the bigwigs in town looking down on him, he thought they might. So he made a different decision. Super easy to criticize King Herod for this. He should be criticized for this. It was a bad choice. But I think if we're honest, we understand those situations. Because being concerned about what other people think of us isn't just a concern for middle schoolers dealing with a bully or weak kings who are trying to hold on to power. We've all been there, where we've known what the right thing to do is, but we've been worried about what other people will think. And we've made a different choice. We have the power. We've been given the power to make those tough choices. Jesus has sent his disciples out to heal the world. But sometimes we don't realize the power we have. We have more limits than we would like. We have more power than we know. And so I think we actually do have saltiness and light here. I get kind of salty when I can't do the things I want to do. And yet God's light still shines through us, empowering us, sending us out, not alone, but together, to be a part of God's kingdom work in the world. And so as we rise now and sing our hymn of the day, I love to tell the story. We remember that God continues to make us salt and light, that despite our limits, we are given power. And God's story continues to be told over and over again in and through us. Thanks be to God. Amen.